The brass casings clinked like wind chimes as they dropped into Kira Brennan's collection bucket. Each one caught the August sunlight differently, some still warm from recent firing, others already cooling in the Nevada desert heat. She moved methodically across the range at Forward Operating Base Phoenix, her boots leaving prints in the fine sand that covered everything out here. 2 hours north of Las Vegas, where the military-owned land that stretched to every horizon. 25 years old, and this was her world now. Picking up spent ammunition while men with expensive rifles and expensive egos proved themselves against paper targets. Staff Sergeant Dalton Krause stood 50 yards away, holding court with his custom .338 Lapua Magnum rifle like it was Excalibur itself. The weapon gleamed, all black carbon fiber and precision machining, the kind of equipment that cost more than Kira made in 6 months. Krause was tall, broad-shouldered, with that particular brand of confidence that came from being good at something and making damn sure everyone knew it. His blonde hair was regulation short, his face tanned and lined from years of squinting through scopes at distant targets. This beauty can reach out to 1,500 meters with surgical precision, Krause announced to the cluster of junior snipers gathered around him, like disciples at the feet of a prophet. Of course, it takes years of training and natural talent to handle equipment like this. Not everyone's cut out for precision work. Kira kept collecting casings. She'd heard variations of this speech a dozen times. The Sermon on the Mount of Marksmanship. The gospel, according to men who'd never missed a chance to remind her what she wasn't. Corporal Wade Hutchins, Krause's ever-present shadow, laughed on cue. 1,500 meters. That's like shooting from here to the commissary and back. The longest confirmed kill in military history was 3,540 meters, Krause continued, warming to his subject. His voice carried that lecturing tone that drill instructors perfected, loud enough to be heard, performative enough to ensure everyone knew they were supposed to be listening. That's over 2 miles. Can you imagine the skill required? The bullet flight time alone is 6 seconds. You have to account for wind drift, humidity, temperature, even the Earth's rotation at that distance. One of the younger soldiers, a private, fresh from sniper school, looked appropriately awed. Have you ever attempted anything close to that distance, Staff Sergeant? Krause's smile had sharp edges. My personal best is 1,800 meters. Made that shot at Fort Benning back in 2021. Anything beyond 2,000 is more luck than skill, if you ask me. Though I suppose some of these fancy competition shooters claim they can hit targets at 3,000 plus meters. He paused, his eyes scanning the desert landscape. Different world from combat shooting, though. Out there, you don't get second chances. Kira's hands moved automatically, collecting the .308 Winchester casings, the .338 Lapua Magnums, occasionally a .50 BMG round that gleamed like a small brass missile. Her fingers knew them all by touch now. 6 months of this work had taught her every caliber, every grain weight, every manufacturer's head stamp. What Krause and his disciples didn't know was that Kira had grown up doing this exact kind of shooting, just not on a military range, not with an audience, not with anything to prove except that she could hear what the wind was saying if she listened hard enough. Montana ranch country, where she'd spent her summers from age 11 to 15, her grandfather's spread, 3,000 acres of high prairie that rolled up into the Rockies like God had gotten lazy with the landscape and just crumpled it up at the edges. That's where she'd learned to shoot, not at paper, at reality. Coyotes at 800 meters were considered practice shots, prairie dogs at 600 if you wanted to stay sharp. But her grandfather hadn't been just any rancher. What about you, Brennan? Kira's head snapped up. Krause was looking directly at her now, that predatory grin spreading across his face like oil on water. The other snipers had turned too, a semicircle of expectant faces waiting for the entertainment to begin. Staff Sergeant? She kept her voice neutral. Professional. Give them nothing. I see you watching our training sessions. You ever fire anything bigger than a service pistol? The desert sun felt heavier suddenly. Kira was aware of the weight of the bucket in her hand, the casings inside shifting with a sound like rattlesnake warnings. She was aware of her uniform, the same as theirs, but somehow different on her. She was aware of being 25 years old and invisible until moments like this, when she became a curiosity, an amusement. "I've done some shooting, Staff Sergeant." Some shooting. Kraus repeated her words like they were in a foreign language he was trying to translate. A few chuckles rippled through his audience. "Let me guess. Basic marksmanship in boot camp. Maybe hit a few targets at 300 meters. Something like that. It wasn't a lie, just incomplete, like saying the ocean was wet." Specialist Griffin Maddox, the unit's designated marksman, shifted uncomfortably. He was older than most of them, 28, with the quiet competence of someone who'd actually been places and done things rather than just talking about them. Former 75th Ranger Regiment before he'd transferred to this unit. He'd always treated Kira with basic human decency, which made him practically a saint in this environment. "Leave her alone," Maddox said quietly. "She's just doing her job." But Kraus was warmed up now, and there was an edge to his performance that felt personal. More than just the usual hazing, something with teeth. No, I think Maddox is onto something. We're always talking about how anyone can learn to shoot, right? Brennan here seems interested in what we do. He gestured expansively at the range, at the distant targets, at the whole masculine theater of it all. Maybe we should give her a demonstration of what real precision shooting looks like. Kira set down the bucket, slowly, carefully, the way you'd set down something fragile before a storm hit. "I appreciate the offer, Staff Sergeant, but I should finish my duties." "Come on," Hutchins chimed in, emboldened by Kraus's attention. "Don't be shy, it's just for fun." But Kraus's eyes had taken on a calculating look. He walked over to his spotting scope, a high-end piece of equipment worth more than Kira's truck, and began scanning the range that extended far into the desert. The sun was past its peak now, settling into that late afternoon slant that turned the whole world into brass and shadow. "See that rock outcropping way out there?" Kraus was pointing to something on the horizon, something that shimmered in the heat haze like a mirage. "The one that looks like a camel's hump?" Kira followed his gesture. She could barely make it out, a dark shape against the lighter desert floor, wavering in the thermal distortion. "That's 4,000 meters, Kraus announced, his voice carrying across the range with the authority of a man who'd measured it. 2.5 miles. I'll paint a target on that rock. Let's say a 24-inch circle. Brennan, if you can hit that target, I'll personally request your transfer to the sniper program and write a commendation letter." He paused, and the smile that followed was all teeth and no warmth. "Hell, I'll even apologize for every dismissive comment I've made about support personnel." The laughter died. Even Hutchins looked uncertain now, sensing that this had crossed from joke into something else. 4,000 meters wasn't just difficult, it was nearly impossible. Beyond the range of most military sniper rifles, beyond training, beyond reason. "Staff Sergeant," Maddox said, his voice carrying a warning, 4,000 meters is way beyond anything we've trained for. That's extreme, long-range competition territory. Nobody here has—" "I'm not expecting her to make the shot," Kraus interrupted. His eyes never left Kira's face. "I just want to demonstrate what separates real marksmen from maintenance personnel. When she misses by 50 meters, maybe she'll understand why it takes years of training to do what we do." There was something else in his voice now, something that went beyond casual cruelty. It sounded almost like recognition, resentment, like this wasn't random at all. Kira felt something shift inside her chest, a lock turning, a door opening. "What rifle would I be using?" Kraus's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. He hadn't expected acceptance. Nobody had. "Well, my .338 Lapua Magnum, of course. Though at 4,000 meters, even that's underpowered. Ideally, you'd want a .375 Shytac or 50 BMG for that distance." What's the ballistic coefficient of your ammunition? The question landed like a grenade in church. Ballistic coefficient wasn't something support personnel asked about. It wasn't something most soldiers discussed at all, unless they were deep into the mathematics of long-range shooting. Krauss recovered his composure, but something had changed in his expression. .670 for the 300-grain Sierra Match King bullets I'm running. Why? Just trying to understand the setup. Kira walked past him to the range flag, watching how it moved in the breeze. The wind was speaking in that language her grandfather had taught her to understand. 3 miles per hour, maybe 4, from the right. But that was here, at ground level. At 2,000 meters, at 3,000, the wind would be doing different things entirely. She pulled out her phone. "Look at this," Hutchins muttered. "She thinks she's a meteorologist now." But Kira was opening an app, a ballistics calculator that she downloaded 2 years ago and used exactly never. Until now. Her fingers moved across the screen, entering data with the kind of familiarity that came from practice nobody here knew about. Distance, altitude, temperature, humidity, wind speed, and direction. "Hold on!" Krauss's voice had lost its mocking edge. "Where did you learn about ballistics calculators?" "YouTube," Kira replied without looking up. "Amazing what you can learn online these days." It was technically true. She had learned advanced ballistics from online sources, but she'd learned the fundamentals somewhere else entirely. From someone who'd understood wind and bullet drop and the Coriolis effect, not as abstract mathematical concepts, but as living, breathing realities that you had to respect or die. From Colonel Theodore Hawkeye Brennan, United States Army, retired, her grandfather, the man who'd held the longest confirmed military sniper shot for 40 years, 3,600 meters, March 1984, Hindu Kush Mountains on the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. A shot that had become legend in the sniper community. A shot that had never been beaten. And Krauss knew. She could see it in his face now, the way recognition was dawning like a cruel sunrise. He'd looked at her personnel file. He'd seen the name. He'd known exactly who she was when he'd issued this challenge. This wasn't about teaching her a lesson. This was about something else entirely. Kira looked up from her phone and met Krauss's eyes. "I'll take the shot." The desert wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the smell of dust and distance and 40 years of unfinished business. Somewhere in the back of Kira's mind, memory flickered like old film footage. Montana, August 2012. She was 13 years old. Her grandfather stood beside her at the ranch's long-range rifle range, a makeshift setup he'd built himself along the eastern property line where the land sloped down toward the Madison River Valley. He was 63 then, still tall and straight-backed despite the years, his hair more silver than brown, his hands steady on the rifle he was teaching her to hold. "Wind," he'd said, "is like a river in the air. It has currents, eddies, fast water, and slow water. You don't just measure it, you read it." The rifle was a Remington 700 in .308 Winchester. Nothing fancy, not like the custom equipment the military snipers used. But in Theodore Brennan's hands, it was precise enough to put bullets into prairie dog-sized targets at 600 meters with the regularity of a metronome. "What do you see?" he'd asked her. Kira had studied the grass on the hillside below them, watching how it moved. "The wind's coming from the left, maybe 5 miles per hour." "At what distance?" That had thrown her. "What do you mean?" "The wind right here might be 5 miles per hour, but what about at 300 meters, at 500? Look at the grass patterns. Look at the dust. The wind isn't the same everywhere." She looked again, and suddenly she could see it. The way the grass moved differently at different distances. Close to them, it barely stirred. Farther out, it bent and waved. Farther still, near the target markers, it flattened in gusts that came and went. "The wind has a fingerprint," her grandfather had said. "Every place, every day, it leaves its mark on the landscape. Your job is to read that fingerprint and understand what it means for your bullet. He'd handed her the rifle then, let her settle into position behind it, adjusted her body alignment with gentle corrections. Elbow here, shoulder there, cheek against the stock like she was whispering secrets to it. Now, 600-meter target, wind is your decision. She'd missed the first shot by 2 feet, the second by 1. The third had gone through the center of the target, and she'd felt the way her grandfather's hand settled on her shoulder, pride transmitted through simple touch. That's the Brennan method, he'd said. We don't just calculate, we feel. The memory dissolved as Captain Sloane Thornton stepped out of the command post. She was 55 years old and looked like she'd earned every one of those years the hard way. Her hair was steel gray, cut short and practical. Her face was weathered in the way that came from decades spent in sun, in wind, in places where comfort was a luxury nobody could afford. She wore her rank like she'd paid for it in blood, which Kira knew from base gossip. She probably had. Thornton had been with Special Operations for 30 years, CIA paramilitary before that. She'd been places that didn't exist on maps and done things that stayed classified even after everyone involved was dead. In the command post window behind her, Kira could see another figure watching, Captain Linda Hayes, the base commander. Hayes was a stern woman in her 50s, rarely seen outside her office unless something significant was happening. Her presence meant this situation had escalated beyond a simple range challenge. Thornton and Hayes exchanged a brief nod before Thornton continued her approach, and she was walking directly toward the shooting line with an expression that made Krause straighten unconsciously. Staff Sergeant Krause, Thornton's voice carried the kind of authority that didn't need volume. What exactly is happening on my range? Ma'am, Krause's swagger had evaporated. Just a friendly demonstration. I challenged Brennan here to attempt a long-range shot. 4,000 meters. Educational purposes. Thornton's eyes moved to Kira. Something passed across her face. Recognition, calculation, something else that looked almost like sadness mixed with steel. Brennan, that would be Specialist Kira Brennan, granddaughter of Colonel Theodore Brennan. It wasn't a question. The air seemed to compress. Every soldier on the range was suddenly paying very close attention. Yes, ma'am, Kira said quietly. Thornton walked closer, her boots making small puffs of dust with each step. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, meant mostly for Kira, but loud enough that everyone could hear. I knew your grandfather, served with him. March 1984, Hindu Kush Mountains. I was his spotter when he made his record shot. The world tilted slightly. Kira had known her grandfather had a spotter that day. You didn't make a shot like that alone. But she'd never known who. Never thought to ask before he'd started forgetting things. Before Alzheimer's had stolen his stories, one synapse at a time. You were 15 years old, Kira breathed, doing the math. Youngest private in the unit, CIA paramilitary operations. I had good eyes, and I could read mountain wind. Thornton's expression softened, fractionally. Your grandfather taught me everything I know about long-range shooting. He was the best I've ever seen. She turned to face Krause, and the softness vanished like it had never existed. Staff Sergeant, this woman's grandfather's record has stood for 40 years. 3,600 meters. 40 years, and nobody, not our best snipers, not SEAL Team 6, not Delta Force, not anyone, has beaten it. Her eyes were ice chips. And you want to challenge his granddaughter to shoot 400 meters farther than that? As what? A joke? A lesson in humility? Krause's face had gone pale. Ma'am, I didn't mean... You meant exactly what you said. I heard every word from the command post. Thornton stepped closer to him. You looked at her personnel file. You saw who she was. And you decided to make her prove herself against a ghost you've been chasing your whole career. The accusation hung in the air like gunsmoke. Kira's mind was reeling. Krause had known. He'd known who she was, who her grandfather had been. This whole thing had been deliberate, personal. "If Specialist Brennan is going to take this shot," Thornton said, her voice carrying across the range like a command from God, "she's going to do it properly. Not as your entertainment sergeant, not as a joke, as a continuation of her grandfather's legacy." She turned to Kira. "The question is, do you want to take this shot?" And there it was, the choice. The door her grandfather had opened decades ago, standing on a mountain in Afghanistan with a rifle and a spotter, and 4,000 meters of thin air between him and history. Kira thought about the last time she'd seen him lucid. February 2020. The ranch house in Montana, winter sun coming through the windows. He'd been having one of his good days, when the Alzheimer's receded enough that he was himself again, trapped in a body that was betraying him, but still sharp enough to know it. "I calculated 4,000 meters once," he'd said, his hands shaking as he wrote in his leather journal. "Back in '84, had all the data, wind, temperature, everything, but we only had one shot that day, and I took the sure thing at 3,600 instead of the glory shot at 4,000. He'd looked at her then, and his eyes had been clear as mountain lakes. "You'll have that chance someday, Kira. When you do, trust the wind. Trust what I taught you. Trust yourself." He died a week later. Pneumonia, quick and cruel. Kira looked at Captain Thornton, at Krause, at the distant rock formation that shimmered in the heat haze like a promise, or a threat, or both. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "I want to take the shot." Thornton nodded once. "Then we do it right. Krause, you'll paint that target and confirm the distance. Maddox, set up a second spotting scope. Hutchins," she paused. "Hutchins, you're dismissed from this range. Now." "But, ma'am," "Did I stutter, Corporal?" Hutchins left, his face red with humiliation and something that looked like fear. Thornton walked with Kira toward Krause's rifle, her voice dropping to something almost gentle. "Your grandfather was the best I ever knew. Not because he had the best equipment or the most experience, because he understood something fundamental about shooting that most people never learn." "What's that, ma'am?" "That at extreme distance, you're not shooting at what you see. You're shooting at where physics tells you the target will be when the bullet arrives. You're shooting 6 seconds into the future." Thornton's eyes held hers. "And that takes more than skill. It takes faith." Kira knelt beside Krause's rifle setup, the .338 Lapua Magnum, mounted on a precision rest, surrounded by equipment that cost more than her car. But underneath all the technology, it was still just a rifle. Still just steel and physics and faith. She pulled out her grandfather's leather journal from her cargo pocket. She'd carried it with her every day since his funeral. Never opened it on base. Never let anyone see it. Until now. The pages were filled with his handwriting, mathematical calculations, wind reading notes, sketches of terrain features and their effects on bullet trajectory. 40 years of accumulated knowledge, distilled into a book the size of her hand. And on the last page, dated February 15th, 2020, in handwriting that shook with age and illness, but still held precision, 4,000 meters is achievable. I calculated it in '84, but never had second opportunity. The wind data is here. Kira, if you read this, trust the mountain wind pattern. 2 o'clock aim point. Grandpa Theodore. Captain Thornton was reading over her shoulder. When she spoke, her voice was thick with something that might have been tears if she'd been anyone else. "He always said you'd be the one to break his record. Even when he started forgetting everything else, he remembered that." Kira looked at the distant rock. 4,000 meters, 2.5 miles, 6.2 seconds of bullet flight through air that would push and pull and twist that projectile in ways that math could predict, but only experience could truly understand. Her grandfather's record had stood for 40 years. It was time to break it. The desert wind whispered secrets in a language only she had been taught to speak. Captain Sloan Thornton stood beside Kira like a guardian carved from stone and memory. The August sun had shifted lower, painting the Nevada desert in shades of amber and copper, the kind of light that made distance deceptive and heat visible. 4,000 meters away, the rock formation called Devil's Hump waited like an accusation. Kira knelt behind Krause's rifle, her hands hovering over the equipment but not touching. Not yet. She was studying it the way a surgeon studies an unfamiliar scalpel, recognizing the purpose, understanding the function, but knowing that mastery required more than simple familiarity. The .338 Lapua Magnum was a work of art. Custom stock, match-grade barrel, Schmidt and Bender scope with enough magnification to count the scales on a lizard at 1,000 meters. The kind of rifle that promised perfection, if only the shooter was worthy of it. "Before you touch that weapon," Thornton said, her voice carrying the weight of decades, "you need to understand something. This shot isn't about the rifle. It's not about the scope or the ammunition or any of this expensive equipment that Sergeant Krause is so proud of." Krause, who'd been standing 30 feet away with his spotting scope and his wounded pride, stiffened but said nothing. "This shot," Thornton continued, "is about reading a story that the desert is telling you. Wind, temperature, air density, humidity, and having the discipline to wait for the moment when all those variables align." She knelt beside Kira, and for a moment she wasn't a captain anymore. She was a 15-year-old private lying in Afghan dirt 40 years ago, learning from the best sniper the Army had ever produced. March 17, 1984. We'd been tracking a Soviet convoy for 3 days through the Hindu Kush. Your grandfather and I were positioned on a ridgeline. Cold. So cold that the rifle metal burned when you touched it. Thornton's eyes were focused on something that wasn't the Nevada desert. The target was a command vehicle, 3,600 meters. The Soviet commander was visible through the window for maybe 90 seconds total. Kira found herself holding her breath. I was spotting, calling wind. I had the best training the CIA could provide, and I was terrified I'd get it wrong. "You know what your grandfather said to me?" "What?" He said, "Thornton, the wind doesn't care about your fear. It's just air moving from high pressure to low pressure. Stop being scared of it and start listening to what it's telling you." Thornton smiled, and it transformed her weathered face into something younger. Then he took the shot. 6.1 seconds of bullet flight. The round went through the command vehicle's window and changed the course of that entire operation. She pulled out her own phone, not to check messages, but to show Kira a photograph. Old, faded. The colors had that washed-out quality of film from the 80s. Two soldiers stood on a mountain ridge, exhausted and alive. Theodore Brennan, at 35 years old, tall and lean with dark hair and eyes that had seen things, beside a teenage girl in oversized combat gear who was grinning like she'd just discovered fire. "He made me keep this," Thornton said quietly. "Said someday I might need to remember what it felt like to be young and certain that impossible things were possible." Kira stared at the photograph. Her grandfather, decades before Alzheimer's, had stolen him piece by piece, before age had bent him, before everything that came after. "He talked about you," Kira said. "In his good moments, near the end, he'd mention Afghanistan, Hindu Kush. He'd say, 'Thornton had the best eyes I ever worked with.'" She swallowed against the tightness in her throat. Then 5 minutes later, he'd forget he'd said it. Forget Afghanistan. Forget everything except sometimes my name. Thornton placed her hand on Kira's shoulder. The same gesture, Kira realized, that her grandfather must have used 40 years ago on a different mountain with a different, impossible shot. He didn't forget the important things. Not really. When I visited him in 2019, when the Alzheimer's was bad, you want to know what he remembered? What? Your name, your face, and the fact that you were going to break his record. Thornton's grip tightened. He said it 3 times that afternoon. "Kira will make the 4,000-meter shot. I showed her how. She'll do what I couldn't." The words hit like incoming fire. Krause's voice cut across the range, sharp with impatience and maybe something else. maybe fear that he was watching his worldview crack apart. Are we doing this or not? I've got the target painted. 4,000 meters confirmed by laser rangefinder. 24-inch orange circle. Perfect conditions for a demonstration of Sergeant Krause, Thornton said without turning to look at him. If you speak again before I give you permission, I will have you cleaning latrines until you retire. Are we clear? Silence. Thornton stood, walked over to where Krause had set up his equipment array, the Kestrel weather meter, the tablet with ballistic software, the range cards with pre-calculated data for every 100 meters. She picked up the Kestrel, looked at it, then set it back down like it was radioactive. This is how modern snipers shoot, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. They trust their technology. They input data into computers. They let software tell them where to aim. She walked back to Kira. This is how your grandfather shot. This is how I learned. This is how you'll make this shot if you're going to make it at all. From her cargo pocket, Thornton pulled out a small notebook. Not leather like Theodore Brennan's journal, but the same principle. Waterproof paper, handwritten notes, the accumulated wisdom of someone who'd learned to read wind in places where mistakes got you killed. Old school, Maddox said quietly. He'd set up the second spotting scope like Thornton had ordered, and now he was watching with the kind of attention that suggested he understood he was witnessing something rare. Cold War methodology. Methodology that worked when your fancy apps didn't exist, Thornton shot back. But there was no heat in it, just fact. She opened her notebook, showed Kira pages of wind calculations, terrain sketches, notes about thermal layers and mirage patterns, and how different altitudes created different wind corridors. Hindu Kush mountains taught me that wind isn't just speed and direction. It's layers. It's invisible rivers flowing at different speeds at different heights. Her finger traced across a sketch of a mountain valley. At ground level, you might have 3 miles per hour. At 500 meters elevation, 8 miles per hour. At 1,000 meters, 12. And all of it moving in slightly different directions because terrain funnels air like water. Kira looked at the Nevada desert stretching toward Devil's Hump. No mountains here, but the principle was the same. Heat rising from sand created thermals. Altitude changes created pressure differentials. Wind had texture and depth, even when you couldn't see it. Your grandfather's journal, Thornton said. The calculations he made for 4,000 meters. Show me. Kira opened the leather-bound book to the last page. Theodore Brennan's handwriting, shaky but determined, filled with numbers and notes. Thornton studied it for a long moment. Then she smiled, and it was the saddest, proudest expression Kira had ever seen. He was right. The math is perfect. 2 o'clock aim point to account for Coriolis effect and the prevailing westerly wind pattern in this region. She looked up at the sky, at the angle of the sun, at the way heat made the distant horizon shimmer. But he was calculating for morning conditions. It's 14:30 hours now. Afternoon thermals are different. How different? The desert floor has been heating all day. Rising air creates updrafts. Those updrafts interact with the wind, creating turbulence at specific altitude bands. Thornton pulled out a pencil, started making notes in her own book. At this time of day, you'll have a thermal layer between 2,000 and 2,500 meters. Wind will accelerate through that layer, then slow again above it. She was teaching, the same way Theodore Brennan had taught her 4 decades ago, the same way he'd taught Kira on that Montana ranch. Knowledge flowing like water from one generation to the next. So I need to account for increased wind drift in the middle of the bullet's flight path, Kira said slowly, working through the problem. Exactly. Your grandfather's 2 o'clock aim point was correct for the base calculation, but add another half minute of angle to the left to compensate for the thermal acceleration zone. Kira made the adjustment in her mind, then in her grandfather's journal, adding her own notes to his. It felt sacred somehow, completing his calculations, finishing what he'd started. There's something else you need to know, Thornton said. Her voice had dropped lower, more intimate. Your grandfather didn't make that 3,600-meter shot on his first try. Kira looked up sharply. February 1984. We were positioned on the same ridgeline, tracking Soviet movements. Your grandfather attempted the long-range interdiction 9 times over 3 weeks. Thornton's eyes held a distant quality, seeing through time. 9 times he calculated the wind, made the shot, and missed. Not by much, but at that distance, 6 inches might as well be 6 miles. He never told me that. He wouldn't. The official record only shows the success, but I was there for every failure. Thornton's voice was gentle now. The first miss, he was angry. Checked his calculations 3 times, convinced he'd made a math error. Second miss, he questioned the rifle. Third through 7th, he blamed himself. Called himself washed up. Said maybe he was too old to make shots like that anymore. What changed? The 8th miss, he stopped being angry, stopped questioning. He just accepted that he was learning something, that each failure was teaching him about that specific piece of ground, that specific wind pattern, that specific distance. Thornton looked directly at Kira. The 9th miss, he smiled afterward. I asked him why. He said, now I know what doesn't work. Tomorrow, I'll know what does. And the 10th shot made history. Kira felt something shift in her chest. Her grandfather hadn't been perfect, hadn't been some superhuman marksman who never missed. He'd been human, fallible, someone who succeeded because he'd failed enough times to understand why. He kept the brass casing from his first failed attempt, Thornton said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth, unwrapped it carefully, like handling something holy. It was a spent .308 Winchester casing, tarnished with age. The head stamp read, Federal, 1984. He gave this to me in 2019, during that visit I mentioned. Said, give this to Kira when she needs to understand that legends aren't born perfect. They're forged through repeated failure until failure becomes impossible. Kira took the casing. It was warm from being in Thornton's pocket, or maybe from carrying 40 years of meaning. Her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. Not here, not now. 10 attempts to make one perfect shot, she whispered, and you have 1 attempt to make yours. Thornton's voice was iron wrapped in compassion. But you're not starting from 0. You're starting from his 9 failures and 1 success. You're starting from everything he learned and wrote down and passed to you. You're attempt number 11, Kira, and you're already ahead. Movement at the edge of the range made them both turn. Hutchins was back, approaching slowly, his face flushed with something that might have been shame or anger or both. He stopped 20 feet away, hesitated. Corporal Hutchins, Thornton's voice could have cut glass. I dismissed you. Ma'am, he looked at the ground. I wanted to apologize. To Specialist Brennan. Kira stood slowly, the brass casing still in her hand. Hutchins took a breath. I've been acting like an ass, making your job harder because it made me feel bigger. That's not what we're supposed to be, not what the uniform means. He met her eyes finally. Your grandfather was a legend. I looked him up after the captain mentioned him. 3,600 meters, 40 years unbeaten. And I've been, he trailed off. You've been afraid, Kira said quietly, afraid that someone you didn't respect might be better than you. Hutchins flinched like she'd struck him, but he nodded. I accept your apology, Kira said, but I don't need it. The shot I'm about to take isn't about you. It's not about proving you wrong or making you feel small. It's about finishing something my grandfather started. She turned back to the rifle. The conversation was over. Hutchins left. This time, he didn't look back. The wind's changing, Maddox called from his spotting scope, picking up from the west, maybe 5 miles per hour now. Thornton checked her watch. 1440 hours. Thermal activity will peak in the next 20 minutes, then start to decrease as the sun gets lower. She looked at Kira. You want to shoot during peak thermals or wait for them to settle? It was a test. Kira knew it was a test. She thought about her grandfather's journal, about the wind fingerprint concept he'd taught her, about reading what the desert was saying rather than fighting it. Peak thermals, she said. Consistent is better than variable. Right now the thermals are strong but steady. In an hour they'll be weakening and unstable. Harder to predict. Thornton's smile was brief but genuine. Correct. Your grandfather would have said the same thing. Kira knelt behind the rifle again. This time she touched it, adjusted the stock to fit her shoulder, checked the scope settings, verified the zero. All the mechanical preparations that came before the real work of reading wind and calculating futures. Ballistic coefficient 0.67, she said aloud, working through the problem. 300 grains Sierra Match King. Muzzle velocity 2,700 feet per second. 4,000 meters. 6.2 seconds of flight time. Her hands moved through her grandfather's journal, cross-referencing his notes with what Thornton had taught her about thermal layers. Bullet drop will be, she did the calculation, 1,375 inches, 114.5 feet. Correct, Thornton confirmed. Wind drift, 3 miles per hour surface wind, but 8 to 9 miles per hour through the thermal layer at 2,500 meters altitude. More calculations, using formulas her grandfather had written down decades ago. Base drift at 3 miles per hour would be 96 inches. Thermal acceleration adds another 48 inches. Total drift, 144 inches, 12 feet. To the right, Thornton prompted. To the right, with a Coriolis effect of 3.2 inches also right. Total rightward drift, 12 feet, 3 inches. Maddox whistled low. She's doing this in her head? Her grandfather could calculate ballistics faster than most people could use a calculator, Thornton said. Apparently it runs in the family. Kira looked through the scope. At maximum magnification, she could just make out the orange circle painted on Devil's Hump. It wavered in the heat mirage, dancing and shifting like it existed in several places at once. Mirage, she said. What about it? Thornton asked. It's heavy, boiling up from the desert floor. That means the thermal layer is active and strong. Kira studied the pattern. But it's consistent, not swirling or erratic. Good for shooting through. She adjusted the scope's elevation knob. Counting clicks. Each click was 1/4 minute of angle. She needed a lot of clicks. 32 minutes of angle to account for bullet drop. 128 clicks. Her fingers turned the knob. Click, click, click. The sound was meditative, rhythmic, like counting prayer beads. Then windage. 4 minutes of angle left to compensate for the rightward wind drift in Coriolis. 16 clicks. Position yourself, Thornton said. Show me the fundamentals your grandfather taught you. Kira settled behind the rifle. Body at a 45-degree angle to the bore line. Left elbow under the rifle for support. Right hand on the grip. Finger indexed along the receiver. Not on the trigger yet. Cheek weld against the stock. Firm but not forced. Stock placement, Thornton corrected gently. Higher in your shoulder. You want the recoil to push straight back, not up. Kira adjusted. Better. Now breathe. Find your natural respiratory pause. Kira inhaled slowly. Exhaled. At the bottom of the breath, there was a moment of perfect stillness. That was where the shot would happen. In that pause between breaths when the body was motionless and the mind was clear. Natural point of aim, Thornton said. Close your eyes. Relax completely. Let the rifle point where your body wants it to point. Kira closed her eyes. Let all the tension drain from her muscles. The rifle moved slightly, settling into its natural position. She opened her eyes. The crosshair was 6 inches low and 2 inches right of where she'd been aiming. Adjust your body, not the rifle, Thornton instructed. Scoot your hips, pivot your torso, get your natural point of aim on target so you're not fighting your own body. Kira made the adjustments, closed her eyes again, relaxed. Opened them. The crosshair was on target now, held there by bone structure and body position rather than muscle tension. Good, Thornton said. That's how your grandfather shot. Minimum effort, maximum stability. The rifle is an extension of your skeleton, not something you're wrestling with. Through the scope, Kira watched the orange target, watched it shimmer and dance in the heat, watched the mirage patterns shift and flow like water that had forgotten it was supposed to fall down instead of up. She waited. Seconds became minutes. Her finger stayed indexed along the receiver. Patient. The desert spoke its language of thermals and wind and distance, and she listened. "What are you waiting for?" Krause's voice, tight with frustration. "The window," Kira said without taking her eye from the scope. "The moment when all the variables align." Her grandfather had taught her this. Montana summer, August 2013. They'd been attempting an 800-meter shot on a coyote that was harassing the cattle. They'd lain in position for 40 minutes before he'd taken the shot. Afterwards, she'd asked why it took so long. "Because," he'd said, "I was waiting for the wind to tell me it was ready." Shooting isn't about forcing your will on physics. It's about finding the moment when physics cooperates with your intent. The wind across the Nevada desert shifted, steadied. The mirage pattern changed from chaotic to laminar, flowing smoothly from left to right. "Winds settled," Maddox called, "holding steady at 8 miles per hour from 270 degrees. Kira's finger moved to the trigger, found the crescent of metal that separated intention from action. Applied pressure. 2 pounds. 3 pounds. The trigger on this rifle broke at 4.5 pounds. She breathed in, let it out halfway, paused in that moment of respiratory stillness. The crosshair was on target, 12 feet 3 inches to the left of the orange circle, accounting for all the drift, 114 feet of elevation adjustment dialed into the scope. Through the heat in the distance and the 6.2 seconds that separated now from impact, Kira could almost see her grandfather. Standing on a ridgeline in Afghanistan 40 years ago, making his own impossible calculation. "This is for you, Hawkeye," she whispered, and pressed the trigger through its breakpoint. The rifle roared, recoiled. The scope lifted and came back down. Kira stayed in position, eye on the scope, watching through the mirage and the heat shimmer and the vast distance for something she knew she wouldn't be able to see. The bullet was flying now, spinning at 250,000 revolutions per minute, shedding velocity with every microsecond, dropping, drifting, following the invisible path that mathematics had predicted, but faith had to complete. 6.2 seconds. It felt like 6 years. Time became elastic. Kira remained frozen behind the rifle, her eye pressed to the scope, watching 4,000 meters of shimmering desert air for evidence of impact. The recoil had been clean, straight back into her shoulder, exactly as it should be. The follow-through was textbook. She hadn't flinched, hadn't pulled a shot, hadn't done any of the 1,000 small things that could ruin precision at this distance. Now came the hardest part, waiting. Staff Sergeant Dalton Krause had his eye glued to his high-powered spotting scope, adjusted to maximum magnification and focused on Devil's Hump. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles jumped. Beside him, Specialist Griffin Maddox manned the second scope, his breathing controlled and professional. Captain Sloane Thornton stood between them, binoculars raised, her body still as carved granite. She'd seen this before, 40 years ago. Different desert, different rifle, different shooter. But the same mathematics, the same faith. 1 second. The bullet had traveled approximately 450 meters, still supersonic, still climbing slightly on its parabolic arc before gravity took full hold. 2 seconds. 900 meters. The bullet was at the apex of its flight now, beginning the long descent, wind pushing it incrementally to the right with every meter of forward travel. 3 seconds. 1,350 meters. Halfway there. The bullet had shed significant velocity, was transonic now, that unstable region where the sound barrier played havoc with aerodynamics. This was where lesser bullets tumbled, where cheap ammunition failed. 4 seconds. 1,800 meters. The Sierra Match King was doing what it was designed to do, maintaining stability even as velocity dropped below the speed of sound, even as wind battered it, even as the Coriolis effect exerted its gentle but inexorable rightward push. 5 seconds. 2,250 meters. The bullet was deep into subsonic territory now, dropping fast, following a steep angle downward toward distant rock. The thermal layer at 2,500 meters grabbed it, accelerated the wind drift just as Thornton had predicted. 6 seconds. The bullet crossed into the final stretch, 2,700 meters and closing. The orange circle painted on Devil's Hump was approaching fast in bullet time, though from the firing line it would appear motionless, patient, waiting to see if mathematics and faith were enough. 6.2 seconds. Impact. The sound came back across the desert like distant thunder. That distinctive crack of copper-jacketed lead striking stone at high velocity. The acoustic signature of violence delivered from so far away it seemed almost gentle. Kraus made a sound. Not quite a gasp, not quite a curse. Something between disbelief and awe. Status, Thornton said calmly, though her knuckles on the binoculars were white. Kraus didn't respond immediately. He was adjusting the focus on his scope, fine-tuning, checking and rechecking what he was seeing. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. Hit. She hit the target. I need specifics, Sergeant. Where on the target? Maddox spoke up, his voice carrying a note of wonder. Captain, I'm seeing impact at approximately 2 o'clock from center, maybe 3 inches from dead center of the circle. Silence descended like a physical presence. The kind of silence that happens when the impossible becomes real, and everyone witnessing it needs a moment to adjust their understanding of reality. Kira slowly lifted her head from the scope. She'd felt it the moment she'd pulled the trigger. The perfect release. The rifle settling into recoil exactly as it should. The kind of shot where you knew, even before the bullet arrived, that everything had been right. But knowing and confirming were different things. 3 inches from center, she repeated softly. At 4,000 meters. Thornton lowered her binoculars, turned to look at Kira. Her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears if Captain Sloane Thornton was the kind of woman who cried, which, according to base legend, she was not. Not just 3 inches from center, Thornton said quietly. 2 o'clock position. That's the Brennan signature. Your grandfather always favored 2 o'clock for long-range work. Said it accounted for Coriolis more naturally than center hold. Every shot over 2,000 meters, he aimed 2 o'clock. Kraus was still staring through his spotting scope, like it might change what it was showing him if he looked hard enough. Nobody shoots 2 o'clock anymore. Modern ballistics software optimized it out. We aim center and dial the Coriolis into the scope adjustment. Old school methodology, Maddox said, and there was respect in his voice now. Real respect, not the performative kind. She used her grandfather's technique. 40-year-old methodology just outperformed modern ballistic software. It wasn't the methodology, Thornton corrected. It was understanding. She didn't just calculate the shot. She read the conditions and made the calculation serve the reality she was seeing. That's what separates marksmen from masters. Kira stood slowly. Her legs felt strange, like she'd been kneeling for hours instead of minutes. She looked at her hands. They weren't shaking. The adrenaline would come later, she knew. Right now, she was still in that crystalline state of focus, where emotion hadn't caught up with action. She'd done it. 4,000 meters, 400 meters beyond her grandfather's record. The shot he'd calculated but never taken. The shot he'd prepared her for without ever saying it explicitly. She pulled out his leather journal, looked at the last page, at his shaky handwriting from February 2020. Trust the mountain wind pattern. 2 o'clock aim point. He'd known. Even dying, even with Alzheimer's eating his brain one synapse at a time, some core part of Colonel Theodore Hawkeye Brennan had known his granddaughter would stand on a desert range one day and finish what he'd started. "Ma'am," Kira said to Thornton, her voice steady despite the emotion roiling underneath. "I'd like to verify the impact. Visual confirmation." Thornton nodded. "Maddox, get a vehicle. We're going to Devil's Hump." The drive across the desert took 20 minutes in a military Humvee that protested every rock and wash with mechanical groans. Kira sat in the back, the leather journal still in her hands, watching the rock formation grow from a distant shimmer into solid reality. Krause had insisted on coming, so had Maddox. Thornton drove with a kind of aggressive competence that suggested she'd driven through worse terrain under hostile fire. The Nevada desert was practically a highway by comparison. Nobody spoke much. The magnitude of what had happened was settling over them like dust, finding its way into every silence. When they reached Devil's Hump, Thornton parked the Humvee at the base, and they climbed the remaining 50 yards on foot. The rock formation was sandstone and basalt, weathered by millennia of wind into something that did, indeed, resemble a camel's hump if you squinted and had an imagination. The orange circle Krause had painted was vivid against the rust-colored stone. 24 inches in diameter, marked with spray paint that was already baking in the afternoon heat. And there, at the 2 o'clock position, 3 inches from the geometric center of the circle, was the impact. The bullet had struck with enough force to crater the sandstone. A divot the size of a quarter, surrounded by spider-web fractures where the shock wave had propagated through the rock. Copper jacket fragments glinted in the crater, all that remained of the Sierra Match King after its violent meeting with physics and geology. Krause knelt beside it, pulled out his phone, activated the measuring app, held it up to the impact point. 2.8 inches from center, he said, his voice empty of the swagger it had carried on the firing line. At a distance of 4,014 meters. He showed them the phone screen with the laser rangefinder reading. 4,014 meters. She overshot the even 4,000 by 14 meters. Wind pushed it farther than calculated, Kira said. She wasn't gloating. She was analyzing the way her grandfather had taught her. Every shot was a lesson, even the successful ones. The thermal layer was stronger than I accounted for, added maybe 0.2 seconds of flight time in the subsonic region. Thornton was studying the impact with the intensity of an archaeologist examining ancient text. 2 o'clock, 3 inches off center at 4,000 meters. Do you know what the statistical probability of that is on a first attempt? Low, Maddox offered. Lower than low. Astronomically improbable. Thornton looked at Kira. Your grandfather attempted his 3,600-meter shot 9 times before succeeding. You made 4,000 on the first attempt. I had his notes, Kira said quietly. His calculations. 40 years of his experience written down and handed to me. I wasn't starting from zero. I was starting from his lifetime of knowledge. She knelt beside the impact point, touched the crater gently. The stone was still warm from the bullet's kinetic energy converting to heat. Under her fingertips, she could feel the violence of the impact, the tremendous forces involved in throwing a small piece of copper and lead across 2.5 miles and having it arrive with enough energy to shatter rock. Colonel Brennan would have been proud, Thornton said. She'd taken off her cover, holding it against her chest in something that looked almost like a salute. This shot, Kira, this breaks his record. Hell, this breaks every record. 4,000 meters in combat conditions, with equipment you'd never used before on the first attempt. Krause was staring at the impact like it had personally betrayed him. His face was ashen, and when he spoke, his voice was rough. I was wrong. About everything. About you. About what skill looks like. About... He trailed off, swallowed hard. Your grandfather was a legend I spent my entire career trying to match, and I never even came close. 1,800 meters was my best. I was proud of that, thought it made me special. He looked at Kira finally, and the arrogance was gone from his eyes. What remained looked like humility, raw and uncomfortable on someone who'd never had to wear it before. Then you walk onto my range, and you're picking up brass casings, and I thought you were nothing. Support personnel, maintenance, not a real soldier. He laughed, but it was bitter. I saw your personnel file, saw Theodore Brennan listed as your grandfather, and instead of respecting that, instead of thinking maybe there was more to you than I could see, I decided to humiliate you, make you prove you weren't worthy of the name. Why? Kira asked, not angry, genuinely curious. Kraus ran his hand over his face. Because I was jealous of a man who died before I could ever compete with him, of a legacy I could never touch. And when I saw his granddaughter picking up brass on my range, it felt like the universe was mocking me, showing me that even his descendants were closer to greatness than I'd ever be. He stood, brushed dust from his knees. When he met Kira's eyes again, there was something approaching respect there. I owe you more than an apology. I owe you acknowledgement that everything I thought I knew about shooting, about skill, about what makes someone a warrior, all of it was incomplete at best, wrong at worst. He straightened to attention, formally. Specialist Brennan, I was out of line. As your superior non-commissioned officer and as a fellow soldier, I let my ego compromise my judgment and my honor. That was unacceptable. Kira stood as well. Apology accepted, Staff Sergeant. But you should know, this shot wasn't about proving you wrong. It was never about you at all. I'm starting to understand that. Kraus looked back at the impact point. What was it about? Kira pulled out the spent brass casing Thornton had given her earlier, the one from Theodore Brennan's first failed attempt in 1984. She held it up so it caught the desert sun. It was about understanding that failure is just another form of data. My grandfather missed 9 times before he made history. He kept the brass from that first miss to remind himself that legends aren't born, they're built, one failed shot at a time, until failure becomes impossible. She looked at Kraus. You're not wrong to be proud of 1,800 meters. That's an exceptional shot. But you were wrong to think that exceptional was the ceiling. It's just a floor. The foundation you build greater things on. Maddox had been quiet through all of this, but now he spoke up. She's right. I've been shooting for 10 years. Army Ranger training, advanced marksmanship courses, all of it. Best I've ever done is 1,400 meters. And I was proud of that too. But watching Kira work through the calculations, watching her wait for the perfect moment, he shook his head. That was masterclass. That was what shooting looks like when it's not about ego or equipment or bragging rights. When it's about respecting the craft. Thornton had her phone out, taking photographs of the impact point from multiple angles. This needs to be documented, measured, verified by independent sources. Kira, when we get back to base, I'm writing this up for the record. 4,014 meters. First cold bore attempt. Witnesses present. This goes into the books. Ma'am, Kira said carefully, I appreciate that, but I don't need recognition. This was personal, between me and my grandfather's memory. I understand that, but this isn't just about you anymore. Thornton's expression was serious. Your grandfather's record stood for 40 years. It became legend. It inspired thousands of soldiers to push themselves, to believe that extraordinary things were possible with enough skill and dedication. Your shot, this shot, it does the same thing. It proves that records exist to be broken, that the next generation doesn't just inherit legacy, they expand it. She put her phone away, looked Kira directly in the eyes. Theodore Brennan's record inspired my entire career, made me believe that a 15-year-old kid from Cleveland could become something more than she was. Your shot will do that for someone else. Some young soldier who thinks they've hit their ceiling will hear about the 25-year-old woman who broke a 40-year record on her first attempt. And they'll realize that ceilings are just artificial limits we accept because we don't know better. Kira felt the weight of that settling over her. She'd thought this was about closure, about finishing what her grandfather had started, about proving to herself that she could honor his memory with action rather than just grief. But Thornton was right. Legacy wasn't private. It was public. It was what you left behind for others to build on. Then we document it properly, Kira said. Full verification, independent witnesses, make it official. Already planning on it, Thornton started back toward the Humvee. Let's get back to base. We've got paperwork to file and history to record. The ride back was different from the ride out. The silence had changed texture. Where before it had been heavy with the weight of the impossible made real, now it carried something else. Possibility. The sense that boundaries everyone had accepted as fixed were actually negotiable. Kraus drove this time. Thornton sat in the passenger seat, already composing her report on her phone. Kira and Maddox sat in the back. "Can I ask you something?" Maddox said quietly, voice low enough that the front seat couldn't hear over the engine noise. "Sure. When you were setting up that shot, calculating the wind, the thermals, all of it, were you scared?" Kira considered the question. Not scared, but aware. Aware that I was attempting something that might be beyond my skill. Aware that my grandfather had tried and failed 9 times before succeeding at a shorter distance. Aware that I was using his notes, his calculations, but that I'd never actually shot at anything close to 4,000 meters before. But you took the shot anyway, because he'd prepared me for it, even if he didn't know he was doing it at the time. Every lesson on that Montana ranch, every time he made me calculate bullet drop or read wind patterns or wait for the perfect moment, he was teaching me how to make this exact shot. She looked out at the desert streaming past. I wasn't scared because I wasn't alone. His 40 years of experience were right there with me in that journal. His voice in my head saying, "Trust the wind. Wait for it to tell you it's ready." Maddox was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're going to be famous, you know. This shot, it's going to spread through the military community like wildfire. By tomorrow, everyone at FOB Phoenix will know. By next week, the whole Army will know. The woman who broke Hawkeye Brennan's 40-year record." Kira wasn't sure how she felt about that. Fame had never been the goal, but Thornton's words echoed in her mind. Your shot will inspire someone else. Make them believe that extraordinary things are possible. When they reached the base, a small crowd had already gathered at the range. Word had spread the way it always did in military communities, through whispers and text messages and the invisible network of soldiers who always somehow knew when something significant had happened. Captain Linda Hayes was there, the base commander, standing with her arms crossed, waiting. She walked over as they climbed out of the Humvee, her expression unreadable. "Captain Thornton, Specialist Brennan, my office, now." Kira's stomach dropped. This felt like the beginning of trouble. Had she violated some regulation by taking the shot? Was there going to be consequences she hadn't anticipated? They followed Hayes to the command building, up 2 flights of stairs, into an office that was Spartan and efficient like its occupant. Hayes closed the door, gestured for them to sit. Then she smiled. It transformed her entire face. 4,014 meters, verified by laser rangefinder, witnessed by multiple personnel. Impact documented and photographed. Hayes leaned back in her chair. "Specialist Brennan, do you have any idea what you've just done?" "Ma'am, You've broken a record that stood since before you were born. A record set by one of the finest snipers this military has ever produced. And you did it on your first attempt, using methodology from the Cold War era that most modern snipers have dismissed as obsolete." Hayes' smile widened. This is the kind of story that reminds people why they serve, why excellence matters, why tradition and innovation aren't opposites. They're partners. She pulled out a folder from her desk. "I received a call 20 minutes ago from Colonel James Morrison at JSOC. Apparently news travels fast. He wants you transferred to Fort Bragg for evaluation and potential placement in advanced sniper training. Delta Force is interested. SEAL Team 6 is interested. Everyone who heard about this shot is interested. Kira felt like the ground had shifted underneath her. Ma'am, I'm not sniper qualified. I'm maintenance personnel. I was just... You were just making a 4,000-meter shot that most qualified snipers couldn't make with a month of attempts. Hayes cut her off, but gently. Specialist, you can stay in maintenance if that's what you want, but you've demonstrated capabilities that the military desperately needs. Precision, long-range interdiction is a critical skill set, and you've proven you have it at the highest level. Thornton spoke up. Ma'am, if I may, Specialist Brennan should have time to process this before making career decisions. This was an emotional event for her. Her grandfather's legacy is deeply personal. Hayes nodded. Agreed. Brennan, you have 1 week to decide. If you want to pursue sniper qualification and advanced training, the door is open. If you prefer to remain in your current assignment, that's your right. But understand, what you did today changes things. You can't make a shot like that and expect the world to leave you alone. I understand, ma'am. Dismissed, both of you. Outside Hayes' office, Thornton put a hand on Kira's shoulder. You okay? I don't know yet, Kira admitted. This morning I was invisible. Now everyone wants a piece of me. That's a lot to process. Welcome to what your grandfather dealt with after his record shot. He hated the attention at first. All he'd wanted was to complete the mission. But eventually he understood that attention came with responsibility. People looked up to him. Young snipers wanted to learn from him. He had a choice, hide from it or use it to make others better. What did he choose? He taught. For 30 years after he retired, he consulted with sniper schools, mentored young shooters, wrote articles about long-range marksmanship. He took the legend that had been built around him and used it to elevate everyone else. Thornton's grip tightened slightly. That's what legacy really is. Not the record, not the fame. It's what you do with the platform you're given. Kira thought about the leather journal in her pocket. 40 years of accumulated knowledge, written down and passed forward. Her grandfather hadn't hoarded his expertise. He'd shared it. Even dying, even with his mind failing, he'd made sure his knowledge would survive him. I need to think, she said. Take your time, but Kira, whatever you decide, know that your grandfather would be proud. Not because you broke his record, because you honored what he taught you. You made the shot he'd calculated but never taken. You finished his work. Thornton walked away, leaving Kira alone in the corridor. She pulled out her phone, opened her photos, found the picture she'd taken of her grandfather's grave marker before deploying to FOB Phoenix. Colonel Theodore Hawkeye Brennan, 1949 to 2020. Beloved father, grandfather, soldier. Longest shot, 3,600 meters, 1984 to 2024. The dates on the record now read like a span of history, 40 years, an entire generation, and she just closed that chapter and opened a new one. Her phone buzzed, a text from a number she didn't recognize. This is Maddox. Listen, some of us are heading to the rec building tonight. Low-key thing. Thought you might want to decompress with people who won't ask you to make speeches or relive the shot 50 times. Just soldiers hanging out. You're welcome to join. She stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back. I'll be there, thanks. Another buzz. Different number. Specialist Brennan, this is Captain Hayes. I forgot to mention, your quarters assignment has been changed. You're no longer in transient barracks. Permanent quarters, Building 7, Room 14. Figured you'd earned an upgrade. Keys are at the admin desk. Kira walked to Building 7 in a daze. The sun was setting now, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of Montana, of ranch land stretching to the horizon, of a grandfather who'd seen something in his teenage granddaughter and decided to teach her how to do impossible things. Room 14 was bigger than her old quarters. Still military issue sparse, but with a window that looked out over the range. She could see the distant rock formations from here, could see the direction of Devil's Hump, even if the formation itself was too far away to make out. She sat on the bed, pulled out the leather journal one more time, flipped through pages of calculations and wind notes and sketches. Her grandfather's handwriting getting shakier as the years progressed until the final entries were barely legible. But the last page was clear enough. The calculations for 4,000 meters, the note about trusting the wind, the signature, Grandpa Theodore. She found a pen, turned to the first blank page after his notes. August 14th, 2024, FOB, Phoenix, Nevada. 4,014 meters, first attempt. Impact, 2 o'clock, 2.8 inches from center. Wind, 8 miles per hour from 270 degrees. Temperature, 96 degrees Fahrenheit. Everything you taught me, Grandpa. Every lesson. Every patient hour on the ranch explaining bullet drop and wind drift and why shooting is physics and faith combined. It all came together today. Captain Thornton says your record inspired her entire career, that it made thousands of soldiers believe extraordinary things were possible. I understand now why you kept shooting even when you missed 9 times. Because the shots that miss teach you as much as the shots that hit, maybe more. I don't know what comes next. They want me to transfer to advanced training. Want me to become what you were, a master sniper, a teacher, a legend. That's a lot of pressure for someone who just wanted to honor your memory. But I'm starting to understand that honoring your memory isn't about preserving it like a museum piece. It's about continuing it, building on it, taking what you gave me and pushing it forward. So maybe I will go to Fort Bragg. Maybe I will learn to be what you were. Not to replace you, that's impossible, but to carry forward what you started. The Brennan method lives on. Your record is broken, but your legacy is stronger than ever. I love you, Grandpa. I hope wherever you are, you saw that shot. I hope you're proud. Your granddaughter, Kira. She closed the journal carefully, placed it on the small desk under the window. Tomorrow she'd make decisions. Tonight, she'd just exist in the space between who she'd been and who she was becoming. The recreation building was crowded when Kira arrived. Not with the whole base, this was clearly a smaller gathering. Maddox was there, along with a dozen other soldiers from various units. No officers, no formality, just people unwinding after a long day. Maddox waved her over to a table where he sat with 3 others. "Brennan, you made it. This is Corporal Sarah Mitchell, Logistics, Sergeant Tom Rivers, Motor Pool, and Private First Class Danny Walsh, Communications." They all nodded greetings. If they knew about the shot, and they almost certainly did, they were polite enough not to lead with it. "Beer?" Maddox offered, sliding a cold bottle across the table. "Thanks." Kira sat, grateful for the normalcy of it. Just soldiers being soldiers. They talked about nothing important. Sports, terrible movies they'd watched, the legendary inedibility of the dining facility's meatloaf. Normal conversation that had nothing to do with impossible shots or broken records or legacy. It was exactly what she needed. An hour in, Krause appeared in the doorway. He spotted Kira, hesitated, then walked over. "Brennan, can I talk to you for a minute?" The table went quiet. Maddox looked ready to intervene if necessary. "It's fine," Kira said, standing. She followed Krause to a quieter corner of the room. "I wanted to apologize again," Krause said, "properly this time, without an audience or the pressure of the moment." He looked uncomfortable, like apologies were a foreign language he was struggling to pronounce. "What I did was unprofessional and disrespectful. I challenged you not to see what you could do, but to prove what I thought you couldn't do. That was wrong on multiple levels. I already accepted your apology, Staff Sergeant. I know, but I realized I never explained why I was so threatened by you." He took a breath. "My whole career I've been chasing your grandfather's shadow. I read every article about him, studied his techniques, tried to understand what made him exceptional. And the conclusion I came to was that he was just better than me, more talented, more dedicated, more everything. He looked at his hands like they'd betrayed him. When I saw your name on the personnel roster, saw Theodore Brennan listed as your grandfather, it hit me that even his granddaughter was probably better than I'd ever be. And instead of being inspired by that, instead of seeing it as an opportunity to learn, I saw it as a threat to my ego. Your 1,800-meter shot is still impressive, Kira said. It is, but I was using it as a ceiling instead of a floor. You showed me the difference. Kraus met her eyes. If you go to advanced training, if you become a sniper, you're going to be exceptional. Better than me, better than most. And I want you to know that I'll support that. No more competition, no more resentment, just respect for someone carrying forward a legacy that deserves to be carried. Kira extended her hand. Thank you, Staff Sergeant. That means more than you know. He shook it, relief visible on his face. Then he left, and Kira returned to the table where Maddox and the others were pretending they hadn't been watching the whole interaction. Everything good? Maddox asked. Yeah, everything's good. The night wore on. More soldiers filtered in and out. A few approached Kira, awkward and respectful, to say they'd heard about the shot and thought it was incredible. She thanked them, deflected attention when she could, accepted it gracefully when she couldn't. Around 2200 hours, Hutchins appeared at the entrance again. This time, he didn't approach Kira directly. Instead, he walked to the bar, ordered a drink, and sat alone at a corner table. Kira watched him for a moment, the slumped shoulders, the way he stared into his beer like it might have answers. She excused herself from Maddox's table and walked over. Mind if I sit? She asked. Hutchins looked up, surprised. You don't have to. I know. She sat anyway. They were quiet for a moment. Then Hutchins spoke, voice low. I got reassigned. Motor pool maintenance. Captain Thornton's decision. Said I needed to learn humility from the ground up, same way you did. Kira nodded slowly. How do you feel about that? Honestly? Hutchins laughed bitterly. I'm pissed, but I also get it. I've been coasting on Krause's reputation, acting like his shadow made me somebody. It didn't. He looked at her. You picked up brass for 6 months and never complained. Never acted like it was beneath you. I need to learn that. It's not about the job, Kira said. It's about how you do it. My grandfather used to say that a soldier who picks up brass with pride is more valuable than a sniper who shoots with ego. Hutchins took a long drink. Will you teach me? When I'm off motor pool duty. Not the shooting, I'm not asking for that. Just how you approach things. How you stayed humble when you had every right to be arrogant. Kira considered it, then nodded. Yeah, I can do that. Thank you. Hutchins stood, extended his hand. For what it's worth, Specialist Brennan, you earned every bit of respect you're getting. I'm sorry it took me so long to see it. They shook hands. Hutchins left, and Kira returned to Maddox's table with a strange sense of completion. The people who'd tried to diminish her were now learning from her. The circle was complete. Around midnight, she headed back to her new quarters. The base was quiet, most of the lights off. The desert sky was brilliant with stars, the Milky Way visible in a way it never was in cities. Her grandfather had loved this sky. Montana Ranch sky, he called it, even though the Nevada version was slightly different. She stood in the open air between buildings, looking up, and let herself feel everything she'd been holding at bay all day. The grief, the pride, the overwhelming sense of completion mixed with new beginning. The knowledge that she'd finished something her grandfather had started, while simultaneously starting something entirely her own. Tears came finally. Not sad tears, not happy tears, just tears that meant release. That meant the armor could come off for a moment, and she could just be human. I did it, Grandpa, she whispered to the stars. 4,000 meters, just like you calculated, just like you knew I would. The wind picked up slightly, moving across the desert with that particular sound that was almost like language if you listened right. And maybe it was imagination or grief or exhaustion, but for just a moment, Kira could swear she heard her grandfather's voice in it. "Proud of you, kiddo. Always knew you would." She smiled through the tears, wiped her eyes, and went inside. 3 months later, December 2024, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Advanced Sniper School graduation ceremony. Kira stood at attention in her dress uniform, along with 11 other graduates. They'd survived 12 weeks of the most demanding training the military offered. Long-range shooting, urban sniping, fieldcraft, stalking, observation, everything that separated a marksman from a master sniper. She graduated first in the class. The instructors said it was the highest scores they'd seen in 15 years. Her long-range work was described as exceptional to the point of uncanny. Her fieldcraft was textbook perfect. Her understanding of ballistics was doctorate level. But what she was proudest of was something the instructors couldn't measure. The fact that she'd helped her classmates, shared her grandfather's techniques, taught them the Brennan method the way Theodore Brennan had taught her and Captain Thornton before her. Legacy wasn't about hoarding knowledge. It was about spreading it. After the ceremony, after the handshakes and congratulations and official photographs, Kira drove 3 hours to Montana, to the ranch that was hers now, inherited after her grandfather's death, to the grave marker on the hill overlooking the property. The marker had been updated. She'd arranged it herself. Colonel Theodore Hawkeye Brennan, 1949 to 2020. Beloved father, grandfather, soldier. Longest shot, 3,600 meters, 1984 to 2024. Legacy, unmeasurable. She knelt beside it, pulled out the spent brass casing from August 14th, 2024. The casing from the 4,000-meter shot. She'd carried it with her through training, through long nights of study, through moments of doubt and triumph. Now she placed it gently on the grave, next to the casing Thornton had given her from 1984. 2 casings, 40 years apart, continue by blood and teaching, and the understanding that impossible things become possible when one generation teaches the next how to aim. "I made it through sniper school," she said quietly. "Top of the class. They're assigning me to 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta Force, starting in January." The wind moved through the Montana grass, making it dance the way it had when she was 13 and learning to read wind for the first time. "I'm going to teach, like you did. Already got approval to run a workshop on extreme long-range methodology. Going to share everything you taught me, the journal, the techniques, all of it. Because that's what you would have wanted." She stood, looked out over the ranch land rolling toward the Rockies. In a few months, she'd have to sell this place. Couldn't maintain it while serving with Delta. But for now, it was still hers. Still held the echoes of a grandfather teaching his granddaughter how to do impossible things. Her phone buzzed. Text from Captain Thornton. "Saw you graduated top of class. Congratulations. Your grandfather would be insufferably proud." "Hell, I'm insufferably proud. Let me know when you get to Bragg permanently. We should grab dinner. I have stories about your grandfather you haven't heard yet. ST." Kira smiled, texted back. "Dinner sounds great. And Captain, thank you for everything. For being there that day. For teaching me what Grandpa taught you. For making sure his legacy didn't end with him." The response came quickly. "Legacy never ends, Kira. It just changes forms. He lives on in every shot you take, every student you teach, every impossible thing you make possible. That's immortality. ST." Kira put her phone away, took one last look at the grave marker, and walked back to her truck. She had a new assignment waiting, new students to teach, new records to break, new impossible things to make possible. The Brennan method lived on, and somewhere, in whatever place soldiers go when their watch is over, Colonel Theodore Hawkeye Brennan was smiling. The desert wind that day in August had whispered secrets. The Montana wind whispered them now. The same language, the same truth. That legends aren't born, they're taught, they're built. They're passed forward from one generation to the next, growing stronger with each transfer, because each new bearer adds their own strength to what came before. Kira Brennan drove away from the ranch as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of brass and fire. She'd been picking up casings until a sniper dared her to take the 4,000-meter shot. In accepting that challenge, she hadn't just hit a distant target. She'd proven that excellence isn't limited by age or gender or job title. That skill recognized and honored is skill that multiplies. That the most profound victories aren't over others, they're over the limitations we accept as boundaries until someone shows us they were never boundaries at all. Just suggestions we didn't have to follow. The brass casings on her grandfather's grave gleamed in the last light. 2 shots, 40 years apart, continue by blood and faith, and the understanding that impossible is just a word people use before someone proves them wrong. The casing on Theodore Brennan's grave caught the last rays of Montana sunlight, a small piece of metal that represented more than a shot. It represented 40 years of waiting, 4 decades of a record standing unbroken, a lifetime of knowledge passed from grandfather to granddaughter, and the promise that some things, honor, legacy, the Brennan method, were immortal. In her truck, Kira's phone showed a new email. Subject: Workshop on Extreme Long-Range Methodology, 47 students registered. 47 soldiers wanted to learn what Colonel Theodore Hawkeye Brennan had taught her. Wanted to understand that shooting wasn't about equipment or ego. It was about reading wind like poetry, about patience, about faith in physics and yourself. She started the engine. The Montana ranch disappeared in her rearview mirror, but it would never really be gone. It lived in every calculation she made, every student she taught, every impossible shot that became possible because someone believed it could be. Her grandfather's voice, clear as the mountain air. Records are just milestones, Kira. What matters is the road you build for others to travel farther. She'd built that road, 4,014 meters of it, and 47 students were about to walk it. The Brennan legacy wasn't ending, it was multiplying. And somewhere beyond the mountains, beyond the desert, beyond the distances that separated the living from the dead, Colonel Theodore Hawkeye Brennan smiled and whispered to the wind, "That's my girl." The wind carried his words across 40 years and 4,000 meters and delivered them exactly where they needed to go. Home. Kira Brennan had proven them wrong, and she was just getting started.